evening, everyone, and welcome to the New Mexico Jewish Historical Society's speaker program, A Mobster in the Family, Jewish Gangsters. Is there such a thing? Of course. We welcome you. I'm Linda Goff, and I'm president of the New Mexico Jewish Historical Society. And this evening's program will be recorded and uploaded onto our dedicated YouTube channel probably sometime in the next week, but we'll send out an e-blast to everyone to let you know that it will be available again. You did see a flyer on the screen about our fall conference, October 1 and October 22 in Albuquerque, History, Genealogy, and Genetics, Unraveling the Past and the Present. It'll be a great conference, so we hope you'll be able to join us. A couple of housekeeping things. Please remain mute for the program. Naomi's presentation will run about 45 minutes. And if you have questions or comments, please put them in the chat box, and I will be monitoring them and asking the questions or passing the comments along to Naomi. So let me introduce Naomi. Naomi is a past president and longtime member of the New Mexico Jewish Historical Society. Naomi was born in Albuquerque and authored Jewish Albuquerque, 1860 to 1960 in 2010, and is currently working on a new book, Jewish Tucson, which is where she currently lives. Naomi's articles have appeared in the New Mexico Magazine and Tablet Magazine, among many others. She currently lives in Tucson, where she works as Director of Jewish Community Engagement. So Naomi, it's all yours.
Thank you, Linda. I'm so glad to see some familiar faces, some new faces, and we're going to go ahead and get started. I suspect that many of you have your own stories about gangsters or suspected gangsters in the family, so we'll have a chance to chat about that as well. So I am going to go ahead and share my screen with you, and hopefully you see this. Linda, maybe you can give me a thumbs up and just let me know that that's visible. Great. Okay. So how I began this kind of adventure into Jewish outlaws and gangsters was quite by mistake. At the time, this was probably 20 years ago, I heard tale of a gangster in my then husband's Detroit family, and I was intrigued. And so I began to look deeper into this sort of Jewish gangster experience, not only because it was interesting, but also because I think it tells us a lot about the Jewish experience in the 20th century. So I got, as a person who loves history, I got very interested in it, of course. And while some of it looks glamorous from the outside, and there's some questions about people's intentions, etc., I just want to say from the outset that many of the things that happened were actually horrific and very concerning. So I'm not looking to glamorize that at all. When I have given this presentation before, I am often asked kind of about specific gangsters, and I'll mention people along the way, but I'm also going to share this personal story of someone who was known as Sam the Mustache. So the names of gangsters were often very creative, and I'm going to be focused particularly on what I call the Gangster Generation. These were people who were born in the early 20th century, typically immigrants or those who parents had recently immigrated, and we'll see some things about them particularly. There are questions that I get about whether there are gangsters who were based in the Southwest. in New Mexico specifically. And I can share a little bit about that later, but I'll just give you a background that there was a gangster who made his home in the Southwest. He was a Jewish Irishman named Jim Levy. And Jim was known as a gunman for hire in the Black Hills. And he later moved his energies to Tombstone and Tucson, where I am now. He was called in some accounts a notorious desperado, and he was a gambler and a gunslinger. He had 16 kills to his name at quite a young age. Unfortunately, after a disagreement at a card table in Tucson in 1882, he went back to his hotel and was called out in the middle of the night and actually was ambushed and killed. And that was the end of Jim Levy. But that really was an aberration in terms of our gangsters that we're talking about this evening. Early gangster culture. I love this quote. If a woman called out to you on the streets of the Lower East Side, she wasn't calling you to a minion. There were certainly gangs of people on the Lower East Side of New York as a result of immigration. And I should say not only in New York, but London and other immigrant cities as well, who were engaged in illegal activities. Some of their activities included card games, pickpocketing, prostitution. There was some organization, but not a lot. There was a firebug brotherhood that set fires for insurance money and some other not so good activities. But scandals really rocked New York City early in the 20th century. And of course, at this time, we know that there were many new immigrants from Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe, and some of the Jewish individuals who had immigrated to the US earlier from Germany and other places were really uncomfortable about the reputation of these new immigrants. And so they actually joined together to hire a private eye to roam the streets and report back on what he saw in terms of Jewish immigrants and their gangster activities. And they actually came up with a glossary of Yiddish gangster terms, some of which, interestingly enough, are still in use today. So there is a list here, but it's interesting that smack for heroin was a Yiddish word from schmeck, meaning to taste. The rabbi was the underworld boss. And you can see there were many other names, both in Yiddish and English, that were used by the early gangsters in New York, those who, again, weren't terribly organized. But something changed, and that was, again, the rise in immigration and this so-called Gangster Generation. Again, these are individuals born near the start of the 20th century. What were they born into? Well, there was pervasive anti-Semitism and anti-immigrant sentiment in the US. We had Henry Ford and his distribution of papers with every car that were anti-Semitic. The KKK was very active. There was a priest in Detroit, Father Coughlin, who was very, very popular on the radio and extremely anti-Semitic. There were also, of course, education quotas in place. So many of the well-known colleges and universities had a limit on the number of Jewish students that they would admit. And at the time, there were relatively few legitimate routes to success. Not to say there weren't, because there are many of siblings and neighbors of the gangster generation that certainly followed legitimate routes to success. But they were fewer and far between, particularly once the Great Depression started. That really was a challenging time, of course. And the individuals of whom I will speak about tonight, many of them were too young to have fought in World War I. So they were kind of coming of age at a time when U.S. anti-Semitism was at an all-time high between the two wars. So some of those familiar names and faces, you see Meyer Lansky here, Bugsy Siegel, Meyer Mickey Cohen, and you may have seen movies, read books, etc. about these folks, and they were amongst the most well-known of the gang generation. But they certainly weren't, they relied on larger organizations with many, many more participants. Prohibition was one of the main drivers of gangster activities. Before Prohibition, Jews in the US made money from alcohol sales. There were whiskey men, there were saloon keepers in California. And alcohol sales was a legitimate way, of course, of making money, but Prohibition also coincided with this recent arrival of 2 million Eastern European Jews. It is thought that perhaps 50% of the nation's bootleggers were Jewish, and movement that really brought in Prohibition. Primarily was supported by white native-born Protestants. They saw alcohol and alcohol supporters as un-American. It was a sign of one's patriotism in terms of Prohibition. But the Jews who had moved here and had been involved with alcohol sales clearly didn't see it the same way. And this led to the rise of gangs or groups of Jewish and other individuals who primarily were involved in bringing alcohol across the borders and distributing it. And one of the best known organizations that did that was Detroit's Purple Gang. The Purple Gang was interesting that Prohibition started in Michigan 3 years before national prohibition came in. So they had a chance to practice bootlegging before the rest of the country. Just to say as well that Henry Ford, who also was, of course, in Detroit, said he declared that Jews are on the side of liquor and always have been. So there was an instant aligning of Jews with liquor and anti-prohibitionism. So, like I said, the Prohibition and the Purple Gang got their start. They also had an advantage of being able to navigate the border with Canada. And so this Purple Gang really grew in influence. Part of the gang was known as the Little Jewish Navy and actually had boats stationed between the US and Canada and shipped in alcohol across the borders. There was also a fictitious company called the Art Novelty Company, and smuggling was their main activity, but they soon got into other activities that were more typical or that were typical among gangs of the time. The gentleman that I found out about, Sam the Mustache, was a member of the Purple Gang. And this is actually a picture of a movie that was made about them sometime later in the 60s. Sam Norber was born in Southern Illinois. He came from a family of 11 children and was, I believe, the youngest, if not one of the youngest. And his parents peddled items to the miners in Southern Illinois. And Sam grew up there on the streets. It was said he was a talented musician. He could have been a famous violinist, but nobody had the time or energy to put into his education. So the family moved to St. Louis, and he ran with gangs in St. Louis that were not only Jewish, But as a young man, he ran with Irish and Italian gangs as well that were involved in petty crimes. He was sent to a rehabilitation school on the East Coast, and he and his roommate actually put some sheets together, escaped, stole a car, and that was the beginning of a lifetime of crime. You can see he was born in that same time period that I mentioned before, and he was part of the Purple Gang. One of his main, it says here, a pal of Fleischer, that he is the person that this is relating to is named Harry Fleischer. And Harry Fleischer was one of the leaders of the Purple Gang. So just to give you an idea of some of Sam Norber's activities, in 1937, he was a salesman for a tobacco company in Detroit. He was accused of embezzling about $1,000 from his employer. In 1945, he was convicted of breaking gas rationing regulations. So there was a black market for gas rationing cards that he was involved in. And this is just what he was arrested for and prosecuted for. In 1950, there was a Brinks robbery in Boston and an attempted robbery in Cleveland, and he and others got together phony Brinks uniforms and were able to steal money there. He was driving a holdup car and was arrested in 1950, for which he went to prison. In 1957, he was accused of selling drugs in said prison, and he was known as the kingpin of Marquette State Prison. His activities may have been known to some members of the family, but what I heard when I first learned of him was that he was a very generous guest at bar and bat mitzvahs, and he also was on the front page of the Detroit paper in the 70s because he hijacked an aspirin truck, a squib aspirin truck. And the joke in the family was he must have had a terrible headache, but nobody really looked much further into some of his activities. So what were the rackets? What were the organized gangster activities that Sam and his cohorts and other gangsters in other US cities were involved in? There's a nice list here. As you can see, these were terrible, terrible activities that organized gangster groups participated in. By and large, the Jewish gangs, while there were some brothers and others in the gangs, they were primarily affiliations based on friendship or business links, not necessarily family affiliations, as you might see in other ethnic groups' organized gangster activities. There was quite a lot of cooperation in some cities among ethnic groups. Jews tended to organize their activities geographically, and so there was Jewish upon Jewish gang killings as well. But you can see none of these activities are good ones. Union busting. They attacked non-union workers. There was a schedule of prices that you could see. A broken arm cost the union $200. Murder was $500. I mentioned the bootlegging and many of these other activities, including kidnappings. One of the other things the gangsters did was they were involved in throwing sports games for profit. So the sports scandal of 1919 was Arthur Rothstein was the gangster who paid the team to sell out baseball. And this actually the incident led to the beginning of the commissioner of baseball in 1919. When the World Series was thrown that year. So gang members had their hand in a lot of different enterprises. One of them, of course, was Murder Incorporated. This was an enforcement arm of the National Crime Syndicate. And Louis Lemke Buchalter was one of the heads of Murder Inc. This was both Italian American and Jewish American in terms of oversight. And what they did was essentially they were an employment agency. They oversaw 250 contract killers. And the contract killers knew relatively little about the bigger picture of what they were doing, so that they could be, the syndicate could keep its information as private as possible. Well, Buchalter was one of the few gangsters who was actually executed for his activities. In 1944, he was executed after serving time in prison, and he surrendered to federal agents on narcotic charges. So this, there were implications, of course, jail time, but in this case, execution for participation. What was worse than many of the legitimate kinds of consequences were those dealt by other gangsters, whether they were Jewish or in other gangs, because if there was a perception of disloyalty or even decided to go in a different direction, gangsters would not hesitate to kill each other. And this happened frequently. There were a couple of good guys, though. They weren't all bad guys. These are two undercover agents responsible for arresting nearly 5,000 different gang members in a 5-year period. They were masters of disguise. The gentleman on the left, Isidore Izzy Epstein, was an immigrant and father of 7. He used to work in the post office. He spoke German, Polish, Hungarian, Bohemian, Yiddish, and some Italian and Russian. And that helped him deceive those who he was bringing into custody. So there were those who were working to stop the criminal activities. And part of my research included going into declassified FBI files as well to read about some of the tracking and suspicions that the FBI had about different Jewish gangsters, amongst others. They, for example, thought that the members of the Purple Gang could have been responsible for kidnapping Lindbergh's baby because they had kidnapped before and extorted money before. And in fact, it doesn't seem that they were. Someone else was arrested, but they were certainly tracked by the FBI, and many of their activities were. So just to give you a sense of U.S. anti-Semitism, again, this is a 1938 Gallup poll. So this was between the two wars. And this isn't all the questions that were on the poll, but just to give you an idea, which of the following most nearly reflects your opinion about the Jewish question? Well, here we see 31% of respondents in the US said Jews have somewhat different, Jews have somewhat different business methods, and therefore some measures should be taken to prevent Jews from getting too much power in the business world. That's 31% of the population. Going further, 10%. So now we're at a 41% here. If we add those up, we should make it a policy to deport Jews from this country to some new homeland as fast as it can be done without inhumanity. These were US American views. So just to say that there was an undercurrent and an environment of great anti-Semitism, and this was also the environment in which these gangsters were living. remembering as well that the country had endured great financial hardship as a result of the Great Depression. So what was the Jewish response? Because certainly Jewish leaders knew about these illegal activities. They varied. Some Jews really, and Jewish leaders really didn't want this out in public because they knew how precarious their own place in US society was. So some of the responses, for example, here, the third one, the Jewish community was well aware of the Jewish gangsters, but didn't want anything about them printed in the newspaper. We panicked, he admits. We worried what the Gentiles would say and submitted to our fears. That was a journalist. A rabbi from Congregation Beth Shalom in Philadelphia admitted, they were disgraceful. They've dragged the Jewish name in the mud and filth of murder and bribery and corruption. And another Jewish leader in Chicago, something must be rotten within American Jewry if this phenomenon is possible. So there were a wide variety of views. But one of the questions that comes to mind in this nuance of Jewish involvement is, what were the roles of Jews who used their gains as in illegal activities for good causes? There were gang members who certainly donated to worthwhile Jewish philanthropies, hospitals, universities, synagogues. I'll be talking in a moment about how organized gangsters disrupted pro-Nazi rallies in the US. They supported Israel financially, and then they also helped fund search for Nazis. Recently, in the New York Jewish Week in April, Myron Sugarman, and he's known as the godfather of illegal slot machine business. He said he gave a lot of his money away to finance Simon Wiesenthal's Nazi hunting activities. That's what he did with his money. So we need to ask the question, monster or Mensch? Gangsters versus Nazis is an issue that you may be aware of because, and especially because of this short film, which showed the actual footage of a night in the garden. And in this case, the night in the garden was Madison Square Garden. And this was a US German Nazi rally. So these were US citizens who affiliated with the Nazi Party. And I should say that while this was in New York, these activities happened in the Midwest, in California, in the East Coast as well. This was not just a New York phenomenon, but this was big. This was Madison Square Garden. And they framed their entire event around US patriotism. So you can see in the picture on the screen, the flags, it's Washington's birthday. There's a big picture of Washington up. This was a big event in 1939. The leader of the event spoke, and you can watch this film online, and you hear him, you see them using the Nazi salute and symbols. You hear him talking about President Rosenfeld and the Jewish-controlled press. And at the time, there was a organized effort to disrupt these kinds of rallies, starting with those in Newark and New Jersey and New York. So Meyer Lansky and other mobsters were thought to be secured by a New York Jewish jurist, Nathan Perlman, to disrupt these rallies, meaning to beat up those who participated as Nazis. And they did. It had the tacit blessing of Rabbi Stephen Samuel Weiss, provided that no one lost their life in the effort. And there's a book. It's sort of a hard-boiled book, I would call it, not an academic book, called Gangsters versus Nazis by Michael Benson that really gives more detail about these activities nationwide. Judd Teller, who was a reporter at the time for the Yiddish daily newspaper, characterized one of the actions in New York's Yorkville, which was the center of pro-Nazi sympathy, as a miniature reenactment of the night when God struck all the firstborn in Egypt, in terms of the response of the Jewish gangsters who wanted to send their message to the growing group of Nazi sympathizers in the US. So back to Sam the Mustache. So Sam Norber went to jail in Detroit. There were so many Jewish gangsters at the time in Southern Michigan prison that the rabbi and a host, Jackie Cannon, actually produced an album, a comedy album called Pros from the Cons. And you can see on the screen on the left-hand side is a photo of the album. And on the right-hand side is a picture of Sammy Norber without his mustache on the left doing a comedy routine with the host. So that just to give you a taste of what life was like in this prison, if you can believe that. The picture of the gentleman on the left-hand side holding the drink is also a picture of Sammy Norber, Sammy the Mustache minus the mustache. In his later years, he got rid of the mustache and apparently put in a diamond on one of his front teeth. And yet Sammy, too, was an interesting and nuanced fellow. I wrote an article about 10 years ago for Tablet Magazine in which I shared his story a little bit like I'm doing tonight. And I received emails from many people who remembered Sammy's generosity and good spirit. Like many of the other gangsters, he never tried to get family members involved in his business directly. He was an uncle, but did not have children, so they certainly weren't involved. And I just want to read you a bit from, interestingly enough, one of the nephews of Sam Norber, who is actually a Los Angeles police sergeant. So he said, my Uncle Sam, when I lived in Michigan for a year when I was 8 years old, used to take me during the day to his bar, which was owned by the Purple Gang, which was very active and used to launder money, where they laundered money, where he would do the paperwork using an old adding machine while having the bartender provide me with an endless supply of Shirley Temples and ice cream. Can you think of a more wonderful place for an 8-year-old boy? And on Uncle Sam's West Coast ventures, he would stop by with his 2 huge bodyguards, which produced an immense roll of $100 bills in his pocket, among other things. He always had gifts of jewelry every time I saw him, and take my single-parent mom and my brother and I out to the Jewish deli in Westwood, where we never had to wait in line as the staff rushed to prepare a table that could hold enough food to feed not only us and Uncle Sam, but his 2 giant associates as well. And there's story after story about his generosity. And yet his activities were horrific. And I'll share a little more later about that. But by and large, the involvement of Jewish gangsters in organized crime faded after this initial gangster generation. Sammy is an exception to that, and I'll share why momentarily. But in the case of this author, they say they simply no longer needed illegal activities and found more socially acceptable routes to power and prestige. Meyer Lansky's son, in fact, was accepted to West Point on the basis of his own merit completely. And it is said that Meyer Lansky loved driving up to West Point to see his son and the U.S. Military Academy. He took his family there for picnics, if you can imagine it. His son's graduation from the academy gave him the feeling, as perhaps nothing else could, that he had made it in America. So there, in many cases, was a winding down of this criminal activity after World War II in particular, but not entirely. So I want to give you, before I get back to Sammy, I want to give you a few more Southwest connections. I mentioned the Purple Gang and how there was a thought that perhaps they were involved in kidnapping Lindbergh's baby. And so the FBI was tracking Harry Fleischer, one of the main organizers of the Purple Gang, and they tracked him to El Paso and were able to then communicate with other FBI groups in Chicago, Detroit, etc., that he was there, and so he was being tracked. The other Southwest connection is not a Jewish gang connection, but one closer to home in Albuquerque, which is the Lazy Ray Ranch in the Jemez Mountains, was owned by Seth Siders. Seth Siders had made his money kind of in motivational products, books and things like that, to motivate business people. And he was acquainted with the Chicago gangsters, and he had this ranch in the Jemez, and it is said that gangsters would come and go quietly and spend time there when they needed to kind of get out of town and not be seen very much. There's still a little bit of controversy about that. Sam Norber didn't get out of the business. He continued to sell drugs. And you can see this old picture of him here, but this article in the Detroit Free Press talks about, and this is in the 1970s, the men who make their money selling heroin in Detroit. So he continued to sell heroin and be involved in these activities throughout, as far as I know, most of the rest of his life. You might wonder about the religious involvement of gang members. Sammy wasn't particularly a synagogue attending Jewish person, but those of his associates in the gang were. In fact, there's a story that's been written that Harry Fleischer and his brother were at Yom Kippur services, and they went out for a break into the outside of the synagogue, and they noticed several men smoking next to them. And they immediately recognized that they were being tracked by the FBI, because who would be smoking at synagogue on Yom Kippur? Interestingly, Sammy Norber is buried in a Jewish synagogue. You can see his headstone here. He was married 3 times, and this was his third wife, presumably got the headstone for him when he passed away in 1995. So again, there's these contradictions in behavior and in activities. Then I just want to talk a little bit about modern times. There's discussion certainly about Russian Jewish crime and gang activities, which I don't necessarily cover here. But there's also in the media sort of a romanticizing of tough Jews. You think of movies and television shows like the ones I show here, in which Jews are shown as powerful and ruthless, yes, but also attractive. And this comes, in the post-Holocaust era, and also at the same time that Israel has come into its own in terms of statehood, but is also fighting its neighbors to exist. And then we know there are other Jewish individuals who, while not involved in organized crime in the sense of having an entire syndicate or an entire group, certainly organized their crime activities and preyed upon fellow Jews and others, such as Bernie Madoff, who is also pictured here. I know the sentiment among many Jews is, what's so painful about Bernie Madoff is, again, that sense that giving Jews a bad name, particularly in an era where we're seeing much more, and that was several years ago, but in this era in which we're seeing much more anti-Semitism. And so I'm going to stop here. I do have a bibliography that I'm happy to share with anybody who'd like that. And I can ask Linda to perhaps put it in an email to you if that's something that you think you'd like. But I'd love to have a discussion now and either hear your stories or answer any questions that you may have about the topic. So thank you.
Thank you, Naomi. There are a couple of things in the chat box so far. So let me move through those. Earlier on in your conversation, Naomi, someone had said that Arthur Rothstein was in the picture wearing his trademark bow tie. Okay. Another participant said, we need to start with reality that Jews were poor, had large families, and impacted by anti-Semitism. And I'm guessing the intent here is how and why some Jews became involved with crime and crime groups. I don't know if you'd like to respond to that or not.
Yes, that is exactly my point, that was reality. In fact, there is no doubt about it. But as I mentioned, it was a means to an end. And I am sorry for 3 dogs barking at their loudest right now. I hope it's not disturbing anyone. I do see that John Bell has rumor that Al Capone spent time in the Jemez back in the day.
Yeah.
Yes, that's Al Capone is said to have spent time in that ranch that I mentioned. And it was named the Lazy Ray, RAE ranch, after the deceased wife of the owner of the ranch. So, and just so you know too, when you go through some of these files from the FBI and other places, there were Albuquerque FBI agents suspicious of certain things that they were sending to different offices across the country. And, you can read what Hoover himself was, or not, I'm sorry. Yes, what J. Edgar Hoover himself was writing in some memos. So it is a little bit interesting.
Yeah. A question from Diane Katz. How can I best research the Purple Gang in Cleveland? I've found some basic information, but not much.
That's a really good question. I would be happy to get your information and send you some Cleveland specific information, because each town had their own players. Minneapolis, St. Paul, Cleveland, Detroit, Las Vegas, of course, etc. So,
okay, great. I'm sure Diane will appreciate that. From Bev Cooper, actually a member of our board who lives up in Los Alamos, White Rock. My father played pool in Brooklyn with Bugsy Siegel. I asked him how he could do that, and he said, I just played pool with him. I didn't ask what he did. It's probably a safe bet.
I think one of the other things Yes. So Michael Lee is bringing up the fact that Benjamin Siegel hated the name Bugsy because it referred to the fact that he was edgy or on edge, and he hated being called Bugsy Siegel. That was not. So if you played pool with him, you might not want to use that name. Yeah.
From what I can see, I think this is the last of the. Oh,
well,
excuse me.
Interesting question here about Sam Draben. He rode, would you consider, the question is, would you consider him a gangster? He rode with Pancho Villa and was an expert marksman. He later served as a bodyguard to a U.S. president.
Right. Yeah, John Bell comments, not sure if this book was mentioned in your talk or in your bibliography, Naomi, but the book Tough Jews by
Yes.
Rich Cohen is a great book. I've read that a few years ago, and I also recommend it.
I do recommend Tough Jews. It's subtitled Father, Sons, and Gangster Dreams.
Yes.
So, and somebody's asking, is there published information on the Jewish players in Kansas City? Yes. So each of the major cities, St. Louis, Kansas City, others, had a Jewish gangster presence. They may not have been as they may not have had a name as memorable as Purple Gang. And incidentally, the Purple Gang did not like the name Purple Gang. There's a couple different theories on why they were named that, but one of them that makes sense to me is somebody said about them, they're rotten, they're purple, they're like bruises, and so therefore they were called the Purple Gang. But there were a couple other names for them as well that weren't that.
Yeah, Martin Markowitz was asking about Kansas City and also mentioned there was a Max Jaben, Jaben, in Kansas City. There's a name mentioned as well.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So this is great. Somebody's mentioning that on the other side, my grandfather was a deputy sheriff in Las Cruces, New Mexico. So in the 1920s or 30s, which is fascinating. I'd love to hear more about that. Because what is interesting about, at the same time that there's this gangster generation, they are being prosecuted by Jews who are in law enforcement and the judiciary. So, there's an interesting juxtaposition of individuals who are both following the straight and narrow and, in fact, moving toward justice, and those who clearly are doing the opposite.
Yes, and Sherry Spiesel, if I mispronounced your surname, I apologize. My mother long ago told me that some of her girlfriends in Newark, New Jersey, my husband was from Newark, dated some of the Jewish gangsters, such as Bugsy Siegel and maybe Longy Zwillman. I'm not sure I pronounced that quite correctly. And then from Sandy Dietz, also a member of our board, my mother's first cousin was Herman Pastor in St. Paul, who fits your description of how members of their families looked the other way. He was a founder of the Orthodox Shul in St. Paul and was assassinated in the late 50s. He was very generous and always gave us extravagant gifts. He served time for tax evasion, but was always involved with bootlegging, gambling, etc. He was involved with Kid Cain, C-A-I-N, who was well known, and the uncle of his wife. There you go. There you go.
So what I've heard so far has been Kansas City, Cleveland, Detroit, St. Paul, etc. So, I mean, these we have evidence here, even among our group, that folks definitely had connections to some of these underworld activities.
From Diane Katz, read the term or name Purple Gang. I read that the name had something to do with the sport of boxing and men who wore purple trunks.
Yeah, there are a couple different, like I said, there's a couple different theories on how the purples got their name.
Okay.
Were there any Jewish women gangsters?
Good question.
This is a great question. There were not very many Jewish women gangsters to research. That does not mean that Jewish women either didn't know or didn't participate, but these gangs were made up of men primarily. So I'm not going to say no at all, but I think, like in many cases, women's stories don't get told necessarily the same way as men's stories sometimes get told. Recently in the news, and this is more of an aside, Robbie Robertson, who was the lead guitarist with the band, found out when he was growing up that the father who raised him was not his birth father, and his mother was a Canadian of indigenous descent, but his father was Jewish, died before he was born, and was prominent in the Toronto Jewish underworld. And apparently the family took him in when he found out about his father, and he got to know them at that time. So,
okay,
never know.
That's right. Any more comments or questions so we can wrap up this evening? Okay, I don't see anything further. Well, thank you, Naomi, for a really interesting presentation. I heard this about 5 years ago, but I know you've done some additional research, so a lot of what you had to share with us tonight is new material, and we thank you very much. And thank you, everyone who joined us from not only here in New Mexico, but elsewhere from Texas, California. Thank you, thank you. And again, this has been recorded, and we will be making it available probably in about a week's time. So many people have said thank you, that they heard some things that they were not familiar with. So many praises and kudos to you in the chat box, Naomi.
Well, I thank everyone for attending this evening, and look forward to seeing you all in another Zoom sometime soon.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Good night.